"They mock us." The whispered accusation hung in the Texas air, thick as the smoke rising from the bacon. Texas, 1944. The vast pale blue sky of the American Southwest was a world away from the smoldering ruin of Europe, where the war was finally grinding to a close. But here, within a compound secured by rough pine fencing and barbed wire, a silent, moral siege was underway. Inside the stark wooden mess hall, the wives of high-ranking Axis officers' women, who had dined under the shadow of the eagle and the swastika, waited upon by servants and flattered by generals, sat paralyzed. They had been captured near the very end, swept up in the final, brutal collapse. Now, they faced not a firing squad or a dungeon, but a rough-hewn table, tin plates before them, and the intoxicating, deeply offensive scent of American breakfast. Elsa Brandt, wife of the feared Standartenführer Erich Brandt of the Waffen-SS, stared at her plate. 2 fried eggs, 3 strips of crisped bacon, a slab of buttered toast, and black coffee. Her throat was tight with a rage that felt holy. "They mock us," she repeated, the whisper barely audible over the soft, relentless crackle of the bacon fat cooling on the skillet. The American guard, a young, lean soldier with the sun-weathered face of a farm boy, approached her table. His broad-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice slow and gentle, utterly devoid of malice. "That's just the morning meal." He paused, gesturing to the spread. "We call it breakfast." No one moved. The Nazi wives, disciplined even in defeat, held their breath, waiting for the trick, the humiliation, the inevitable cruelty. For years, the Reich's propaganda had hammered home the lie. Americans were vulgar, godless, violent monsters whose captivity was worse than death. This generosity had to be a trap. Then, a small, elderly woman at the far end of the table, Frau Kessler, slowly, hesitantly, picked up her fork. The metal clinked against the tin plate. Her first bite of egg was a tremor, a betrayal. Her second, a surrender. A soundless, collective rhythm of chewing soon filled the room, punctuated only by the clatter of cutlery and the pervasive rich smell of honest food. A smell that was not merely dissolving hunger, but dissolving belief. Elsa watched the guard who had poured her coffee. He offered a polite, casual nod, then turned and walked away, whistling a tune that sounded impossibly light. Crude, godless, violent, she had seen none of that. She saw a cowboy, a mere soldier, offering sustenance to his sworn enemy with the same simple dignity he might offer it to a neighbor. No flags, no speeches, no threats, just 300 calories of fried fat and protein. A terrifying thought stirred in the quiet space where her hate once lived. If they can feed us like this, maybe everything we believed, every word the Führer ever spoke was a lie. The women ate in silence. The bacon tasted of smoke, salt, and something utterly unfamiliar to a broken regime: dignity. Outside, the American flag snapped cleanly in the warm, dry wind. The sun climbed, high over the Texas plains, and somewhere between the gnawing, animal need of hunger and the brittle shell of hatred, a deep, foundational wall began to crumble. That morning, in a camp intended for prisoners of war, a far more profound event occurred. For the first time, these women, raised in the heart of the master race's arrogance, realized that the war for their very souls might have already been lost, not on the battlefield, but at the breakfast table. Before they ever saw Texas, the wives had been given one final, absolute instruction: never surrender to the Americans. German state radio and every propaganda poster had drummed the message into the nation's subconscious. Captivity in the United States, they were promised, meant starvation, unending, brutal labor, and the ultimate, irreparable humiliation. Nazi newsreels relentlessly depicted the United States as a chaotic society of greedy capitalists and brutal criminals, a land utterly devoid of discipline or honor. Elsa Brandt, the meticulous wife of an SS officer, had internalized every word. Her husband, Standartenführer Brandt, a man feared and respected in equal measure, had once told her, "If the Americans ever catch you, they'll put you in chains and work you to death." When she was finally captured in the frantic, disorganized retreat across France, his sentence echoed in her mind like a death toll. She braced for filth, for deliberate cruelty, for the worst her mind could conjure. The journey was a slow blur of train cars and long, silent days. When the transport finally stopped, the Texan air was shockingly different. Dry, sweet, with the unfamiliar scent of sage and sun-baked earth. Instead of the armed dogs and shouting guards she expected, she saw calm, courteous soldiers in khaki uniforms. Instead of abuse, there were orders spoken with an almost baffling politeness. The women were separated, checked efficiently by medical personnel, and issued clean, regulation uniforms. Elsa watched in stunned disbelief as one young American soldier, a man later identified as Private Jake Sullivan, carried a terrified, crying child from the transport, cradling her gently, talking to her in a low, soothing murmur, as if she were his own. Inside the camp, the unreality intensified. There were tidy rows of simple barracks, a small, makeshift chapel, even a tiny library stocked with dog-eared books. At their first dinner, they were served a nourishing stew, fresh bread, and good coffee. One woman whispered, eyes wide, "They are fattening us for something terrible." Another muttered darkly, "It is a performance." A cynical show for the Red Cross inspectors. But as the days bled into weeks, the illusion refused to break. The Americans did not beat them. They did not humiliate them. They did not even speak to them with the contempt Elsa was certain they deserved. The guards were overwhelmingly young men from ranches and small towns, polite, sunburnt, and often endearingly bored. They consistently tipped their hats and said, "Ma'am," even to the wives of the most notorious figures of the fallen regime. The relentless, bewildering kindness gnawed at Elsa. She desperately wanted to hate them. She was, after all, trained to. But hatred requires fuel, and here, in the vast, open anonymity of the American nowhere, surrounded by nothing but the boundless sky, and this strange, stubborn civility, the fire inside her was slowly, irrevocably dying out. At night, she began writing in a small, contraband diary. "If this is their vengeance," she scrawled, "it is worse than violence. It makes me feel small. It makes me feel human." By the end of her first week, the paralyzing fear had transmuted into a feeling she dared not name. Doubt. And for a mind deliberately raised on absolute certainty, doubt was the very beginning of moral collapse. By the autumn of 1944, over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were held across the breadth of the United States, scattered over more than 700 camps from Maine to California. Texas alone held more than 70,000, a number made possible by its immense, vacant land, its mild winters, and its existing, expansive ranch infrastructure. It was here that German soldiers, U-boat crewmen, and even the women captured during the frantic coastal evacuations were housed under the stringent, non-negotiable rules of the Geneva Convention. The American system was shockingly efficient, methodically organized, and almost impossibly humane. Each camp functioned like a meticulously maintained small town, complete with barracks, well-managed mess halls, small garden plots, infirmaries, and structured work rotations. Every single prisoner, even the ideological hardliners, received 3 full, nutritionally adequate meals per day, routine medical attention, and even small work pay in the form of coupons they could spend on personal comforts. To the prisoners, it was utterly unthinkable, not because it was cruel, but because it was civilized. For Elsa Brandt and the other women, this unwavering civility was infinitely more terrifying than any expected punishment. They had been raised in a rigid world where power was defined by domination. Yet here, they saw guards the victorious enemy, who treated them not as defeated animals, but as people who had merely lost a war and were entitled to basic respect. The guards, these cowboys-turned-soldiers, fascinated them. They moved with a relaxed, almost lazy confidence. They joked openly with one another. They carried themselves with a quiet, almost dismissive pride. They seemed to have no fear of anyone, not of their own officers, not of their ideological prisoners, and certainly not of losing face. It was a kind of inner freedom Elsa had never once witnessed in the constrained, fearful atmosphere of wartime Germany, where every forced smile was measured and every spoken word carried a palpable risk of denunciation. One afternoon, standing near the fence line, Elsa watched as Private Jake Sullivan broke a piece of his midday ration and shared it with a stray, mangy dog that had wandered near the perimeter. She turned to a neighboring woman, her voice thick with something that was not bitterness, but a profound, shaken awe. "They feed animals better than we fed our wounded." The American moral order, she was forced to concede, was built not upon the scaffolding of fear, but upon the solid bedrock of fairness. That difference, that small, defining line, cut deeper than any weapon. Behind this casual generosity was an astounding logistical marvel. Factories thousands of miles away were relentlessly churning out not only tanks and bombers, but also the spoons, the tin trays, the bedding, and the uniform cloth that sustained the vast American POW system. The United States was not just fighting with ordnance and men, it was fighting with abundance, an abundance so great it could be extended even to its enemies. Every can of beans, every sliver of soap, every hot meal was irrefutable proof that the US could wage total war while simultaneously upholding its deepest values. For the Nazi wives, this was the most profoundly humiliating truth of all. They had been taught they came from the superior, master race. Yet here they were, utterly dependent on their enemy's surplus kindness just to survive the day. That night, Elsa wrote again, her hand shaking. "They conquer not through cruelty, but through competence. Their order is not fear, it is faith." The women soon discovered that Texas itself was nothing like the desolate, crude wasteland their minds had pictured. The land was harsh and starkly beautiful, an endless sky, golden dust, and the haunting, sweet scent of mesquite wood that clung to every breath. But what truly shocked them was not the landscape, it was the people paid to guard them. The Americans called them cowboys, and to the German women the word meant chaos, lawless savagery, and the rough embodiment of the uncultured. Yet the reality was a devastating contradiction. These men carried themselves with a quiet authority that needed no shouting, no ostentatious symbols, no uniforms heavily adorned with eagles and medals. They held doors open, they said, "Yes, ma'am," and they smiled, even at their prisoners. To women who had been raised on the rigid, unyielding structure of Nazi doctrine, this ceaseless, casual politeness was infuriating. Elsa Brandt especially despised the way one guard, Private Jake Sullivan, unfailingly tipped his hat and offered a simple, "Good morning." "They are mocking us," she told another woman, her voice vibrating with suppressed fury. "They act as if we are equals." But one afternoon, when Private Sullivan greeted her with the same warm, simple nod, something in Elsa finally snapped. "Stop pretending to respect us," she shouted, the German words a sudden sharp intrusion into the Texas quiet. "Do you think we are blind? We see your pity." Private Sullivan stopped dead, taken aback by the sudden outburst. He looked at her not with anger, but with a profound, almost weary calm. Then, in a slow, steady voice that carried the weight of the endless plains, he replied, "Ma'am, I don't pity you. I just don't hate you." The words hung in the silence. Elsa turned away, the fury suddenly replaced by a confusing, destabilizing crack in her own internal wall. For years, she had been surrounded by men who demanded obedience and worship. This man offered neither. He offered only his uninvited, devastating humanity. Later that night, she sat outside the barracks, staring up at the stars, which seemed impossibly bright and cold over the Texas plains. For the first time in her adult life, she thought deeply about what honor truly meant. Back home, it had been synonymous with pride, absolute loyalty, and inevitable victory. Here, it seemed to mean something infinitely smaller, yet impossibly stronger: simple decency. The women began to notice other, equally disturbing things. The guards joked freely with one another, shared cigarettes without measuring portions, and treated even the lowest-ranked enlisted man as a crucial, respected part of their unit. There were no rigid titles, no suffocating ranks among them when they were off duty. Everyone earned respect the same, fundamental way, by showing up, working hard, and treating others decently. One German woman murmured, awed, "They don't need orders to act with dignity." Another replied quietly, the dawning understanding a cold weight in her voice, "That's what makes them dangerous. The cowboy code, as the Americans sometimes called it, was built on self-respect, honesty, and a casual, innate mercy. It did not fit into any ideology the women knew, precisely because it was not built for control. It was built for life. And though they did not yet fully grasp the implications, that simple, unwritten code was becoming the quiet weapon that would shatter their indoctrination forever. The camp awoke early that morning, the air still cool and crisp under the vast Texas sky. In the mess hall, the pervasive, comforting smell of wood smoke drifted through the open windows. It was not the thin, watery smell of the usual oatmeal or ration stew. Something richer was cooking, a scent the women had not known since before the war began. The source was the camp cook, a broad-shouldered, enormous rancher they all knew as Pappy Olson. He was not a formal soldier, but a local civilian hired to feed both the guards and the prisoners alike. His apron was stained, his boots were perpetually dusty, and his voice was loud enough to carry through the rafters. Pappy Olson believed in one thing above all else. If you feed a person right, they will remember you were decent. That day, he had decided, without consulting anyone, to serve the P.O.W.S. a proper, old-fashioned Texan breakfast, thick-cut bacon, fresh eggs, buttery toast, and black coffee. To him, it was merely hospitality. To the women, it was an act of profound, aggressive defiance. When they shuffled into the hall and saw the laden tin plates lined up on the counter, a collective freeze fell over them. Elsa Brandt stopped near the doorway, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The rich, powerful scent of the bacon filled her lungs, a smell she associated with comfort, family, and a Germany that now only existed in a nightmare. Pappy Olson looked up from the immense cast-iron stove, his weathered face creased with an easy smile. "Morning, ladies," he boomed. "Eat up while it's hot." No one moved. Finally, a woman whispered, her eyes terrified, "Is this a test?" Pappy blinked, genuinely confused. "It's breakfast," he said simply. When they remained paralyzed, he sighed, picked up a fork, speared a piece of bacon, and ate it slowly, chewing with loud satisfaction right in front of them. "See?" he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Not poisoned, just bacon." The sheer monumental absurdity of the scene, this giant, good-natured man joking about poison in a prisoner camp, finally broke the paralyzing tension. A nervous laugh escaped one woman, then another. Soon, the room was filled with a brittle, thin, but undeniably real sound of quiet laughter. They sat and began to eat. The first bites were agonizingly slow, cautious. Then, the simple, animal logic of hunger took over. Some women wept silently between forkfuls of egg. Others murmured a prayer-like sound. "It tastes like home." Elsa, who had not truly smiled in months, looked around at the faces of her fellow prisoners, faces momentarily softened, stripped of their ideology by warmth and unbelievable disbelief. Pappy moved between the tables, refilling mugs and dispensing loud, casual jokes. "Ain't no use in hating folks who can't fight back," he said, refilling Elsa's coffee. "You just feed them and hope they remember you were decent." Elsa stared up at him for a long, searching moment. "Why are you kind to us?" she finally managed to ask. Pappy merely shrugged his enormous shoulders. "Ma'am, wars are just work for men in uniforms, a few months of hardship. But breakfast, that's for people, all people." The simplicity of his statement lodged deep in her heart, a tiny, uncomfortable splinter of truth. That morning, as the women ate bacon served by the very people they had been taught to despise as subhuman, something irreversible happened. The poison of the Reich's propaganda, its savage pride, began to melt under the benevolent Texas sun, dissolving completely in the startling restorative taste of unearned kindness. Later, in her journal, Elsa wrote only one line. "The enemy who feeds you takes away your hate." The smell of bacon lingered long after the meal was over. For Elsa Brandt, the memory haunted her thoughts all day, not for the simple taste, but for the profound, moral meaning it carried. That single meal had accomplished what months of Allied leaflets and propaganda broadcasts could never do. It shattered the illusion of superiority. Elsa had once lived in a mansion just outside Berlin. Her husband, Standartenführer Brandt, had a full staff of servants, a personal driver, and endless access to the best imported food and wine, even as British bombs hammered the city. She had worn silk, while others lined up desperately for meager bread rations. Back then, she believed every privilege she enjoyed was proof of her nation's destined greatness and her own inherent worth. But now, standing in a rudimentary Texas camp, surrounded by mere cowboys and soldiers who said, "Yes, ma'am," to a defeated prisoner, she began to perceive a completely different kind of power. The Americans did not need to flaunt their strength. They simply lived it through an undeniable fairness, through a meticulous order, and through an almost embarrassing generosity. That evening, the camp's official interpreter read aloud an article from a local American newspaper about the staggering U.S. war effort. The numbers were immense: millions of tons of supplies, tens of thousands of aircraft, and billions spent even on the Axis prisoners of war. Elsa could barely believe what she was hearing. The United States, the article reported, had spent over $1.8 billion housing and feeding Axis POWs humanely. It was, she realized, far more than her own regime had spent caring for its own common soldiers. The cold, unforgiving math of mercy struck her harder than any bullet. A nation that could so easily afford kindness, and deliberately chose to give it, had already won the war in ways that simple conquest and bullets never could. She remembered the brutal Berlin winter of 1944, when desperation forced families to burn their furniture for a little warmth, when women like her lied mercilessly to neighbors about their ration stamps, and when compassion was universally mocked as a crippling weakness. Here, in the heart of the enemy country, she was eating 3 full meals a day and being treated with unyielding respect. The crushing contrast was almost unbearable. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat on her simple bunk, listening to the soft, distant whinny of horses outside the fence. Their hooves clip-clopping on the dry ground reminded her of her old home, but this new reality was not built on the hollow foundation of racial pride. It was built on the simple, unassailable foundation of decency. The next morning, she helped clean the mess hall, an entirely voluntary act. The guards didn't ask her to do it. No one even noticed. But to her, it was a necessary act of silent confession. In her journal, she wrote, "They defeated us without cruelty. They fed us without asking why. They made me see that our strength was hollow, and theirs was human." She added a final, devastating line, as if to finally make sense of the humiliation that was slowly starting to feel like grace. "They conquered us not with hatred, but with breakfast." Weeks passed, and the camp settled into a quiet, almost domestic rhythm. The German women worked in the laundry, tended small garden plots, and occasionally worked in the stables. The guards treated them not as prisoners of war, but as temporary workers on borrowed time. The war in Europe was visibly winding down, though the women did not yet have the official news. Every Sunday, they were allowed to write brief letters home. Each one was meticulously censored by the U.S. Army, read and stamped before being sent across the Atlantic. But even with every single line scrutinized, the truth they were living found a way to bleed through. Elsa sat at a wooden desk one evening, the pen trembling in her hand. For the first time, she truly did not know what to say to her husband, Standartenführer Erich Brandt, who was rumored to still be fighting somewhere near the smoldering ruins of Dresden. She began with the expected formalities. "We are safe. The Americans treat us fairly." Then, she paused, utterly unable to describe the profound shift she had experienced. How could she explain the unexpected power of the bacon, the easy, quiet laughter, the young cowboy who said, "Ma'am," with unforced courtesy? How could she tell a man who believed in a 1,000-year racial destiny that the so-called inferior people had shown her more honor than anyone she had known in the last decade? Finally, she simply wrote the most dangerous, most revolutionary truth she knew. "They feed us as if we were guests, not prisoners. The men who guard us smile without cruelty. It is strange. It is unbearable. I did not think kindness could wound." When she sealed the letter, she whispered to herself, "If this reaches Germany, perhaps it will save someone." Weeks later, in a ruined, dusty apartment block in Munich, a frail postwoman delivered that very letter to a widow, a close friend of Elsa's, who had lost her husband at the hell of Stalingrad. The woman read the letter aloud to her neighbors, her voice cracking with emotion at the words, "They treat us better than the Reich ever did." The letter spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, copied by hand, and whispered in bomb shelters and basements across the shattered city. It became a quiet, relentless weapon, the truth sent in a common envelope instead of a bullet. Inside the Texas camp, Elsa and the other women never knew how far their words traveled, but they began to notice small, reciprocal changes in the guards. The cowboys started to linger longer after their shifts, talking to the women about horses, American music, and their far-off homes. One evening, Private Jake Sullivan taught them how to whistle like a ranch hand. "You just curl your tongue," he explained, "and let the air do the work." The women laughed when they failed, and he laughed gently with them. For the first time since the war began, Elsa felt completely, simply like a human being. Not a wife, not a prisoner, not a symbol, just a person. And somewhere, deep down, she realized that every word she had written home might be doing more to rebuild her nation than any impossible victory ever could. Spring came early to Texas that year. The air smelled of dust, hay, and the very first, tentative hints of wild flowers blooming just beyond the wire fences. Life in the camp had settled into an almost tedious ordinariness. Routine chores, morning roll calls, and the soft, constant rhythm of the horses in the distance. But for Elsa, each sunrise carried a quiet, inexplicable anticipation. Then, one morning, he returned. The cowboy, the same enormous, broad-shouldered man from the legendary bacon breakfast, Pappy Olson, rode up to the camp gate on a powerful chestnut horse, his hat tipped low against the relentless glare. The guards recognized him instantly and waved him through. He wasn't military. He didn't need to be. Everyone knew he was a friend to the entire camp. Elsa was washing laundry when she saw him, her breath hitched in her throat. He dismounted, brushed the dust from his worn boots, and reached slowly into his saddlebag. From it, he pulled out a single, small glass jar, homemade preserves, sealed simply with a square of wax paper and a length of twine. He handed it to the camp sergeant. "For the ladies," he boomed. "Tell 'em it's peach from my wife's kitchen. Just made this week." The sergeant hesitated, his eyes flicking to the regulations posted on the wall. "You know that's strictly against regulation, Pappy." Pappy grinned, a wide, simple Texan smile. "Then let's just call it a little bit of morale, Sarge." Later that afternoon, the precious preserves were divided meticulously among the women, one perfect, glistening spoonful each. Elsa held her share in her tin bowl as if it were gold. She had not tasted real fruit in years. When she carefully placed the sweet preserve on her tongue, the overwhelming sweetness was almost too much to bear. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from a piercing, unexpected joy. She walked slowly up to the fence line where Pappy stood waiting patiently beside his horse. "Why?" she asked quietly, the question a raw, simple plea. "Why are you doing this for us?" Pappy merely shrugged, his eyes soft and kind beneath the shadow of his weathered hat. "Because wars are near over, Mom. Time to start being people again." For a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up, carrying the faint hum of distant cattle and the light clang of the camp bell. Then, without conscious thought, Elsa reached her hand through the cold, unforgiving wire. Pappy paused for less than a second, then reached out, his rough, enormous hand meeting her delicate, trembling fingers. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched an American. The world seemed to hold its breath. Guards nearby watched in utter silence. No one laughed, no one shouted. It was merely a handshake, a simple, primal human contact. But for both of them, it felt like something profoundly sacred. In that single, perfect instant, the hatred, the centuries of division, amplified by a decade of brutal propaganda, and the blood of the war simply and utterly collapsed. What remained was something far simpler, purer, recognition. Elsa spoke softly, almost a whisper to herself. "You've done something no one else could." Pappy tilted his head inquisitively. "What's that, ma'am?" "You made me forgive." He smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his massive face, touched the brim of his hat, and mounted his horse. "Guess that's a good day's work, then." As he rode away, disappearing into the endless, sun-drenched horizon, the women stood along the fence line, watching his retreating figure. None of them said a word. They didn't need to. Later that night, Elsa wrote one final, profound line in her journal. A cowboy shook my hand, and the war ended, at least for me. By the time the official news of the Axis surrender arrived, the relentless Texas sun had already bleached the camp's wooden fences gray and dry. The guards moved with less urgency now, their boots quieter, their laughter more open and frequent. Rumors of Germany's total surrender drifted through the camp like the warm, dry wind, and with them came an unspoken, terrifying truth. These women were going home soon. For Elsa Brandt, that realization was a crushing, complex burden. She had survived her captivity. She had eaten well, slept safely, and had even managed to smile again. But the deep shame that lingered was not about military defeat. It was about the searing, undeniable truth she had been forced to learn. In her final journal entry before repatriation, she wrote, "They called them cowboys. We called them fools. But it turns out, the fools were us." She remembered the first day she arrived, utterly terrified, clutching desperately to the shattered idea that the Reich still represented order and greatness. And then she remembered the taste of the bacon, the honest, simple laughter of the guards, the devastating finality of the handshake through the wire. Those moments, she understood now, had taught her what years of poisonous ideology had deliberately buried, that power without mercy is utterly hollow, and that dignity without compassion is nothing more than arrogant pride. When the day of departure arrived, the women were gathered near the gate. Military trucks waited to take them to the coastal port. Elsa looked back at the ordinary camp, the neat rows of barracks, the dusty yard where they'd sung fractured German and American Christmas carols with the guards. Everything about it looked so painfully mundane now, yet she knew she would never again see the world the same way. Private Jake Sullivan approached her, tipping his hat low. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you take care now." Elsa managed a faint, genuine smile. "You too, soldier, and thank you for teaching me what honor truly is." He shook his head, his eyes earnest and clear. "You taught yourself, ma'am. We just gave you breakfast." That night, as their transport ship left the coast of Texas, the women watched the shoreline recede into the deepening fog. One woman, a shy former schoolteacher, began to softly hum a melody from home. Then, unexpectedly, another woman joined in with an American folk tune she had learned in the camp. Soon, the two melodies blended a strange, tentative harmony of former enemies, now turned almost to friends. In Germany, Elsa would return to a country in complete ruin, cities burned, families broken. The toxic ideology she once believed in turned to ash. But when people asked her what America was truly like, how the victors had treated their defeated prisoners, she would pause for a long moment before answering. "They beat us," she would say, her voice quiet and steady. Asterisk, asterisk, but not with guns, with kindness. The bacon, the simple handshake, the soft, respectful word, "Ma'am." These became her enduring memories of the war, proof that mercy, once freely given, could easily outlive any empire, no matter how absolute its power. Years later, when asked what victory truly meant, she replied simply, "It wasn't the Allies' bombs that changed us. It was their humanity." And though she never saw Texas again, she kept one single, fragile relic from the camp, a small piece of paper torn from her journal. On it were 6 simple words, faded now, but still perfectly legible. "They fed us, and we became free." When the transport ship finally reached Europe, the German women stepped onto the dock as free people. But they were no longer the same people who had boarded in Texas. The cold air of the ruined homeland felt utterly different now. It carried no pride, no certainty, only the quiet, profound echo of lessons learned in the transformative warmth of a Texas sunrise. Elsa stood at the rail, her fingers clutching the edge of the ship, her eyes fixed on the gray, broken horizon. She thought of the cowboy's handshake, the simple laughter over a tin plate, the strange, overwhelming feeling of dignity she'd been shown by her former enemy. For a moment, she whispered to herself, "We were prisoners, but they freed our souls." Around her, the others murmured similar, quiet thoughts. Some wept softly, some smiled faintly. None of them spoke of Hitler or the Reich. The war had ended, but something far deeper, far more important, had finally begun. The painstaking rebuilding of humanity, one fundamental act of kindness at a time. In the years that followed, stories like Elsa's would circulate quietly through post-war Germany, tales of bacon, kind cowboys, laughter, and an aggressive, overwhelming compassion from those they had been relentlessly taught to despise. And though few believed them at first, those stories slowly grew roots, subtly shaping how a broken nation began to see the world anew. They mocked the cowboy. He fed them instead. History records the victors and the vanquished, but in the fragile spaces between the brutal gunfire and the bitter, final surrender, sometimes the truest, most enduring victory belongs only to those who choose mercy, even when cruelty would have been so much easier.